The 1963 March on Washington was a turning point in the civil rights movement. It showed people of many races coming together peacefully with a message of peace, calling for an end to segregation. It was meant to support President Kennedy's idea of a Civil Rights Act. He wouldn't live to see that act passed, and Congress didn't act immediately to pass the law. It would take a full year and the death of the president to finally get Congress to create a law that would end segregation. And even then, that wouldn't be the end. Just as the ink on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was drying, a new fight was beginning, a fight for voting rights. In the summer following the Civil Rights Act's passing, its signing by President Johnson, students from the North went to the South in what became known as Freedom Summer. What were they trying to achieve? They were trying to help black voters overcome the voting obstacles that had been put in their way: poll taxes, literacy tests, and other such problems. They helped young black students make up for the gaps in their education, the result of unfair segregation under Jim Crow. They helped people get legal advice. This captured the nation's attention when the segregation hound dog began to bite back. The nation's most powerful detective agency, the FBI, investigated the disappearance and later the brutal murder of 3 Freedom Summer activists or workers. They had been badly injured, burned, murdered, and their bodies had been cast into the rivers of the South. It would take over 40 years for their murderers to find justice. This captured the attention of the nation. People across the country were beginning to see just how vicious and stubborn the segregation hound dog had become. And it showed that the fight for civil rights was hardly over, even after the passing of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. It set the stage for what would be something like a final showdown, the Selma to Montgomery March. March 7th, 1965. Bloody Sunday. Dr. King and other civil rights leaders gathered a group of 600 peaceful protesters, black and white. What were they protesting? It was very clear. An end to the Jim Crow voting restrictions of Alabama. Their task was to march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital. The nation watched in horror and with great interest as this peaceful protest erupted into terrible violence. It was widely covered. After nearly 20 days, and a violent confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge over the River Alabama, that group of 600 had swelled to over 25,000 protesters who would finally, 20 days later, reach the steps of the state capitol in Montgomery. The audio recording that you hear comes from that march. We're going to look at it and the events that began on March 7th. We'll be looking at 2 kinds of documents to understand what exactly the protesters were interested in. The first is something that might be very familiar to you. We looked at another very similar example yesterday. Then we'll look at the images that people saw splashed across their newspapers and televisions You can see them on the right. This was the hound dog acting in the most vicious way imaginable. I'd like you to take some notes. We're going to evaluate this document just as you would as an historian in an archive or special library. Let's begin with the document on the left. What is this? This document is one of the literacy tests from the state of Alabama. I'd like you to write that down. It's an Alabama Jim Crow literacy test. We discussed these yesterday and a few weeks earlier. The date is 1965. This is a remarkable date. It was a year after the passing of the Civil Rights Act. This tells us that the Civil Rights Act had its limitations. While it put the first nail in the coffin of Jim Crow segregation laws, it left many weaknesses. It had many weaknesses when it came to addressing unfair voting restrictions. The Selma to Montgomery March was meant to protest documents such as this. Speaking of, what kind of document is it? I don't think it's any of those listed there. While it may be a photograph of the document, it's not itself a photograph. We'll have to mark other. I'd like you to write type of document, legal document. That means it was created by the government. What were these literacy tests? Who created them, and for what purpose? Well, this was created by the state government of Alabama. Remember, that's different from the federal or national government. And Alabama wasn't the only state to have such documents as this. Yesterday we looked at one from Louisiana, a deeply complicated form that black voters had to complete. And of course there was little guarantee, sometimes no guarantee, no chance at all, that their application for voting would be accepted. For whom was this created? Who was the audience for a document like this? This was meant for people who want to register or sign up to vote. But we have to be very clear about one thing when it comes to voting in Jim Crow. While white people were also expected to fill out forms like this, often they were able to do so without much care. This was mainly meant for black voters. The many steps, difficult, sometimes impossible steps, were meant for black voters. That was the main reason, that was the main audience rather. It was the simple purpose, the main job of a document like this. With all of those instructions, we notice that it requires the person applying to vote to recite words from the Constitution, a difficult and old-fashioned document to recite. This tells us that the main job was to create an obstacle for black voters, something to stand in the way of their voting. And it was meant to do so while not appearing to break the Constitution. It was supposed to look legal. But there's a deeper message. What might the state official who created this have been trying to express on a deeper level, beyond the simple job of this document? It was a way of saying that blacks need to be kept out of democracy. Why? If their voices were heard, if they had the ability to influence politics or government by voting, well, that would threaten Jim Crow. It would threaten the kinds of laws that were meant to create other restrictions for blacks. It would give them a say in their government, and clearly they would say that laws like the Jim Crow laws they had grown up with needed to go. It would stop state government, the voting would stop the state government from restricting their lives and their rights. I think there are two important things we can learn from a document such as this. A document such as this that was inspired the protesters at Selma. It tells us that Jim Crow laws relied on dirty tricks. Poll taxes, unfair literacy tests, and intimidation prevented blacks from voting and having their voices heard. Something that we've discussed at length, or for a long time now. But there's something else it reveals. Racist state leaders feared the power of black votes. They feared the voices of black voters enough to try to keep them out of democracy. This is why voting is so important. This is how we show our power, our influence as citizens, as individuals, by voting. This is perhaps the most important task for us in a democracy such as the United States. Documents like this were meant to stop people from voting, from having their voices heard. And so, in March of 1965, protesters began. They were to march from Selma, several hundred miles, to Montgomery, Alabama, to the state capital, where Governor George Wallace lived and worked. Their message was clear. We come in peace, and we ask you to end these unfair laws and let us participate in democracy. What ended up happening was another crisis, the hound dog biting back. What you hear now is actual audio from those events. On March 7th, Dr. King organized a march. It was to include 600 people, blacks and whites. They gathered in Selma, Alabama. Their goal was to march peacefully, hand in hand if needed, across the state to the Capitol building. They were protesting literacy tests and poll taxes. March 7th, Bloody Sunday. The protesters had attracted the attention of journalists from across the country. At first it seemed very promising. They were left unbothered. Then, still in the city of Selma, the protesters approached the Alabama River. Spanning the river was a location that would go down in infamy. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, a bridge named after a Confederate war hero. As the 600 protesters crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge over the Alabama River, this is what they saw. Governor George Wallace had ordered a row of state troopers to stand on the opposite side of the bridge to stop the protesters from going any further. This image from a journalist shows the moment of the confrontation. The state troopers, armed with tear gas, guns, and clubs, ordered the protesters to turn back and disperse immediately, to break up. They respectfully declined. They said no, and stated that they would continue. This is what ensued. The newspapers of the time capture the events in a dramatic way. State police block march in Alabama. Tear gas. Troopers block rights march. Tear gas is a chemical that causes painful discomfort. It's meant to stop protesters. It causes severe discomfort in the eyes, throats, and nose. A melee in Selma. That means it was a combat, as African American marchers were clubbed by the state troopers. Newspapers across the country reported on the injuries and the hospitalizations, the result of the tear gas and the clubs. Alabama march explodes into bloody violence. The day itself would be known as Bloody Sunday. This image shows an officer with a special mask to protect him from the tear gas, which caused excruciating discomfort to the protesters. Image after image went across television screens across the country, a peaceful protest erupting in gruesome violence. People watched in horror as they read the paper or saw the television reports of peaceful protesters beaten. Nevertheless, the organizers of the protest, led by Dr. King and others, made a vow, a solemn promise, to continue their march to the Capitol building in Montgomery, despite the violence. They knew they must overcome it. Finally, on March 15th, the President of the United States himself addressed the violence. Only a day prior, there had been a repeat of the violence of March 7th. The number of protesters had now grown from 600 to 2,000. Governor Wallace at first was reluctant or resistant to protecting them. Finally, because of the pleas of the President of the U.S., he agreed to provide protection against the state troopers. But it wasn't enough. A local Alabama sheriff defied or went against the orders of the governor and the President of the United States, and on March 14th, the attacks resumed or began again. One day later, the President of the United States himself got very closely involved. He addressed or spoke to the entire U.S. Congress in Washington, and his speech was broadcast or sent across television sets in the United States. I'd like you to see some of his words. You're going to hear him speak of the importance of the event. You'll also hear him echo some of the words that we've come to know from the civil rights movement, as he speaks of, "We shall overcome." This is President Johnson responding to the events of Bloody Sunday.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the Congress, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions and of all colors, from every section of this country, to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama.
What was President Johnson saying? He said that there are times when the destiny, the fate of democracy are played out. Our destiny can be seen in a single moment, a single place. That had happened in the American Revolution. It had happened in the American Civil War. And here, he said, it was happening again at Selma. This was a struggle for freedom, the promise of democracy in the United States. What was Johnson doing? This was Johnson's way of saying, we've had enough of the violence. He used this speech, and he used this moment in history to urge Congress to act, to end the voting restrictions that had plagued, that had caused so many people to suffer in the Jim Crow era. He wanted to complete the work of the Civil Rights Act, to give strength to the Constitution, the 15th Amendment, that gave the right to vote to all men. Much as he had made a promise, a solemn vow on the death of President Kennedy, he made a similar vow following the violence on Bloody Sunday. It worked. The president spoke on the 15th. On the 25th, the march had finally reached Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. What began as a peaceful protest of 600 people that had erupted into violence with state troopers ended with the protection of federal troops sent by President Johnson, and the ranks of protesters had now reached 25,000. If that wasn't enough to urge Congress to finally act to end the violence and senselessness of the Jim Crow era, there was one last deed. The very day that those 25,000 protesters reached Alabama to confront the governor to ask him to end the literacy tests, a white woman, a protester from Detroit, Michigan, a mother of 5, 39 years old, had been killed by a segregationist. Even in the moment of triumph, the hound dog of segregation was baring its teeth. The 1965 Selma to Montgomery March was a kind of sequel to the March on Washington, which had been a turning point in the civil rights movement. The march to Selma was meant to be to Montgomery was meant to be a protest against literacy tests and poll taxes. These were very concrete demands. It was a goal that was easily achievable. Simply change the legislation. That was the message that was meant for Governor George Wallace, who had been a staunch or powerful supporter of segregation. But what we see from this event is that it often takes dramatic turns, dramatic changes, violence, death, in order to push change forward during the civil rights movement. As persuasive as Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech may have been to us about change and improving the world for the future, it wasn't enough to get Congress to act in 1963. It took violence, the assassination of President Kennedy, to finally push Congress along to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In many ways, it took the violence of Bloody Sunday on March 7th of 1965 to finally get the Congress to act on voting rights. But that's precisely what happened. Congress did act. In August, less than a year after the Montgomery protesters finally arrived in the steps of the state capitol, Congress acted. President Johnson's vow, his promise of a law that would end poll taxes and literacy tests, became a reality. Let's read an article from U.S. News and World Report that came out just a few days after the signing of the bill. Speaking in the Capitol Rotunda, Mr. Johnson, that's President Johnson, told what the new law does. This law covers many pages, but the heart of the act is plain. Wherever, by clear and objective standards, states and counties are using regulations or laws or tests to deny, to take away the right to vote, then they will be struck down. This was quite forceful language. If it is clear that state officials still intend to discriminate, then federal examiners will be sent in to register all eligible voters. When the prospect of discrimination is gone, the examiners will be immediately withdrawn, taken away. And under this act, if any county anywhere in the nation does not want federal intervention or getting involved, it need only open its polling or voting places to all of its people. What did the Voting Rights Act do? What did it say? What was its promise? This is what it did. It stated that it was wrong, it was illegal, against the Constitution, to create a poll tax, a literacy test, or to intimidate voters. Everyone had a right to vote if they were eligible. Well, what would the federal government do? One of its most powerful tools was this. The Voting Act created a list called a pre-clearance list. It said that states that had a history of standing in the way of creating obstacles to black or any voters had to get special approval from the federal government for their elections to be considered legal. That meant Alabama, in particular, couldn't have its elections finalized until the federal government had signed off on them. How would the federal or national government do that? Well, they would send in inspectors to make sure that no one had been intimidated, that no poll taxes had been paid, that no literacy tests had been given. Only if there was enough evidence that everyone who wished had had a chance to vote would the federal government sign off on states whose elections had been compromised or challenged in the past. It may surprise you to learn that Arizona was on that list, the pre-clearance list, until 2013. Arizona had a history of Jim Crow voting obstacles. That meant that states had to show decades of improvements. It had to show over the passing of many decades that it had gone to great lengths to eliminate the poll taxes and literacy tests that had so long been obstacles to voters. And if an election was shown to be unfair, its results were overturned, thrown out. This was a powerful new tool. It's taken decades to keep the Voting Rights Act, to strengthen it, but it's been an enormous success. Here is Dr. King once again at the side of the president, over at the signing of the bill. Its history is a moving but a sad one. We saw that protesters in Selma came together, people of different races, 600 people at the very beginning. Their peaceful actions were met with the violence of state troopers, ordered by a racist governor into action, and that violence continued. However, it brought the nation together. People were horrified at what they saw. They were persuaded by the sensible requests of the voters and terrified by the violence that they met. This was the last thing that Congress needed to finally act, to finally come together and pass a bill that would end the voting restrictions. Now we're ready to add this to our timeline. We saw the first stage of the march forward came in 1963. In 1964, Congress was finally persuaded, because of those protesters and the death of President Kennedy, to create a law that would prohibit or end or outlaw discrimination. This drove the first nail into the coffin of Jim Crow, and it fulfilled the promise of the 14th Amendment. 1 year later, the Selma to Montgomery march captured the attention of the nation. The persuasive case of the protesters and the horrifying violence that they met finally convinced Congress to create a Voting Rights Act that would defeat poll taxes and literacy tests. Write it with pride. Hold on to this paper. We have one more event to add. But before we get to 1968 and its events, let's look at what it meant, this Voting Rights Act. This primary source is a photograph from 1966, about a year after the Voting Rights Act had become law. A crowd gathers outside the Sugar Shack in Peachtree, Alabama. These people are gathering to vote for the first time in their lives. Many of them were already senior citizens. As a result of the Voting Rights Act, places around the South, especially in places like Alabama and Mississippi, where Jim Crow had been his strongest, post offices, schools, churches, and the outskirts in the countryside, little shops like this, overnight had to be turned into voter registration or polling locations. There was now a task of registering to vote the millions of African American citizens who had never had a chance to do so because of the restrictions that had lay at their feet. This is Tom Flowers. He was 68 years old when he registered to vote for the first time in Mississippi. It was June 1966. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Mr. Flowers. I have some questions for you. I'd like you to write down some notes. Write down how you might answer these. How do you think Mr. Flowers felt when he registered to vote? I'm sure you can sense that he felt quite happy, pleased, overjoyed. But I want you to think deeply, because I think there was something else running through his mind. Why was voting such a powerful act for him? Why should anyone care about voting? Why is it so important? How did the Voting Rights Act of 1965 help make voting possible for him? What specific things did it do? I'd like you to take about 2 minutes to think through these questions. You can answer to anybody in the room, or speak to the screen if you'd like, or write down some notes. I'll tell you what I think in a couple of minutes. Good luck. Well, how'd you do? Let's think about this. I'm sure one of the first things you noticed is that Mr. Flowers likely felt great joy, immense pleasure at being able to vote for the first time in his long life. He also may have felt a little uneasy. Well, he may have thought, well, gee, where are those people there to intimidate me? Where is the literacy test? Sure, he knew that the law was on his side, but maybe part of him still feared that it was too good to be true. Perhaps he still felt a little lingering fear. But there's something else that I think may have been running through his mind. Imagine, if you will, what the person who helped him register may have told him. Congratulations, Mr. Flowers, you'll be voting now. Here is your ballot. I'd like you to look it over very carefully. You'll notice here are the candidates for the state, county, and And you'll also notice that you'll be voting on the 7 candidates for the County Board of Supervisors, only 5 of them. You may only choose 5 of the 7. This is a nonpartisan role, so their party affiliation is not listed. Now, you will also be voting for your state legislative district. There are 2 candidates. Make sure that you are only voting for one. There is only 1 voting spot available. And there's also this bill right here. It's a state bond. It's about whether the state will be allowed to use a bond, to issue one, in order to finance the upcoming school building project. Please note that a vote for yes indicates that you are voting against the bond. Now, make sure that your mark is quite clear. You need to create a straight line, otherwise it may be difficult for us to read. What do you think he may have felt hearing all this? If it were me, and this is certainly how I felt voting the first time, he might feel overwhelmed. Voting is difficult. You have to know a little bit about the law. The language is confusing. Sometimes a vote yes is actually voting against something, and so on. And we have to vote for people who represent our city, our county, our state, and our country. I'll bet Mr. Flowers felt a little overwhelmed. He had not done this before, even if he had been interested in politics. This was the first time actually doing it. Why was voting so powerful? Why was it so important? This was the first time that his voice had been heard in our democracy. As a citizen, he was being heard in a state that had ignored him all his life. How did the Voting Rights Act of 1965 help him vote? What specific things did it do? Well, it got rid of poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidations, obstacles that had stood in his way for all of his life up to now. As you can see from his dates, if he was 68 in 1966, he had grown up completely in the Jim Crow era. This was the fulfillment of a race, of a series of promises that had begun back in the era of Reconstruction. Remember those amendments? This was an era of great time, a great promise for equal rights. Federal leaders in the years after the Civil War had already promised to protect the civil rights of former slaves and, well, all people like Mr. Flowers. What was their way of doing it? Changing, amending the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution provided the tools for Reconstruction to protect our rights. But as we've seen, unfortunately, state governments stood in the way of fulfilling the promises of Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws provided the tools for stopping the amendments from working. What finally stopped the Jim Crow laws? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 drove the final nails into the coffin of Jim Crow as they gave Congress the tools to defeat him once and for all. These 2 acts gave the Constitution its moment to shine. The tools had always been there, but they had been blunted and dulled by the nastiness of Jim Crow. Thanks, America. You had me worried there for a long time, but I knew you'd come through for me in the end. Oh, no, you gotta be kidding me. Really, Jim Crow? Just who do you think you are? You think you could defeat me? I'll show you. Well, just you wait and... Wait, what? In the end, love had conquered Jim Crow. Hey, buddy. We thought you could use a hand. Take care now. Wait. Aren't we missing something? Are we missing someone? We have to go back a little bit. We're forgetting about women. They too were important players in the civil rights movement. After all, remember the 15th Amendment only gave the right to vote to all men. That's right. Women had taken part in the civil rights movement. they became supporters of what's known as women's suffrage. That's an unusual word. It simply means the right to vote. And eventually, they had achieved a great victory for civil rights, long before the Civil Rights Act. The support had gone way back, even to before the Civil War. Frederick Douglass was one of the first supporters of the right of women to vote. And it finally came in 1920. Another change to the Constitution. How did it happen? Well, oddly, state governments had actually been some of the loudest voices in support of women. Odd, considering how many states had stood in the way of the Constitution when it came to Jim Crow laws. The reasons are complicated, but states like Utah, Oregon, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, even Arizona had stood out early on in our history, even in the Reconstruction era, in allowing women to vote in local elections. They still couldn't vote for president, however. And so, a civil rights campaign, a civil rights struggle of its own emerged. Women wrote letters. They made the case in newspapers and in speeches. They marched peacefully in all of the major cities across the country. And of course, they met with obstacles, just as other civil rights leaders had. Take a look at this primary document. This was made by somebody who opposed or went against women's suffrage or voting. Think about the message. Would you rather have a woman at home doing the things a woman is supposed to do, taking care of children, cooking? Or would you rather have her as a mad woman on the streets, screaming at the top of her... No, this is nonsense. We shouldn't find this persuasive at all. Women have the right as much as anyone else to vote. And this was creating an ugly and hateful image. One, it said that women had to do only this one thing of taking care of children and cooking meals and such. Of course, we know that's not true. And if they were given the right to vote, they would become crazy and mad. We know this is nonsense. Women persisted. They caught the attention of the president, President Wilson, in fact. They went to meetings. They went to city council meetings. And they too met many of the other obstacles. They were arrested. They were jailed. Sometimes even beaten. Finally, they got the right to vote. But think about it. Did all women get the right to vote? I'm sure you're guessing that, of course, it was incomplete. The 19th Amendment did indeed give all people the right to vote, women, men, but you can rest assured that African American women, along with African American men, had to wait for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65 to finally give them the right that they had always had all along. That's when they finally scored the home run they had been waiting for all those years. Take out your civil rights baseball page. It's time to find home plate. Two teams up against each other. The ugly Jim Crow team and the civil rights team, here represented by Jackie Robinson. Here's the pitch, and Jackie Robinson, the civil rights team, has lobbed it and slides in to first base. Integration in Major League Baseball, one of the first great steps, the first great stages in the civil rights movement. And a new player joins the civil rights team, Jackie Robinson. The struggle continued. Next would be the unfair court decisions, such as Plessy versus Ferguson, that promoted or helped push segregation. Take that, Chimera. Then began the integration in schools, with the Brown versus Board of Education victory. And guess who what? More people are here to join our civil rights team. There's Oliver and Linda Brown, and their most persuasive advocate, Thurgood Marshall, and, well, we can't forget the rest of the people to join us. That's right, all 9 justices joined the civil rights team by voting in favor of civil rights. Now, it's a matter of getting rid of those illegal actions by states. Down in Arkansas and Louisiana, people and states are standing in the way of integration. Take that, Medusa. The Little Rock 9 crisis showed that the federal government could get involved and force integration. 9 brave players join our team. And the most powerful of them all, the president himself becomes a player for civil rights. Let's not forget the troops that he sent. And the struggle wasn't over in 1957. Ruby Bridges continued, and she wasn't alone either. Remember Mrs. Henry? And one other person joined. This is Ruby Bridges many years later. Who is she sitting with? Whose hand is she holding? You may not recognize that man because he's much older. Maybe this picture will show you. He was one of the men wearing the armband in 1960. This is a U.S. Marshal. He too joined the civil rights team. Finally, Jim Crow laws had to go. The chimera guarding home plate needed to be destroyed. The end of de jure segregation in the U.S., the end of voting discrimination. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act brought the civil rights team to home plate. It was the home run we've been waiting for. And our civil rights baseball team has grown beyond imagination. Rosa Parks was there, Dr. King, even President Kennedy and President Johnson, all the protesters at Selma. What does this tell us? What can we infer about the process of integration in the United States from this great victory? After nearly a century of hard work and sacrifice and incomplete victories along the way, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act finally defeated Jim Crow laws and helped supporters of integration reach, say it with me, say it with pride, they had finally reached home plate. Integration was a slow process, and it happened one small step at a time. The federal government finally showed that it was ready to defend civil rights, even if it meant conflict with the states. State governments over time also began to show a greater readiness, a greater willingness to defend civil rights. But there's one thing else we know. Not only was it a slow process, not only was it slow, but it took the efforts of thousands of people. The Civil Rights Dream Team. All of these people joined in the efforts for equality. It took great effort and sacrifice from many people to finally help the U.S. become better integrated. We had finally reached the home run we were looking for. We're ready now to finish our baseball metaphor. I want you to add home plate. There's the ugly chimera guarding it. Jim Crow laws themselves. Write it neatly. And in all caps, bold and with pride and love, the end of de jure segregation in U.S. finally came as the Civil Rights Dream Team slid into home plate with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act. We've finally reached home plate. The Civil Rights Dream Team had made the home run that we were looking for after nearly a century. Let's do one last thing before you go today. Let's play a little game of integration baseball, civil rights baseball. Stand up, show me what you know, move your body around. Here we go.